The skyline rips open as a volley of missiles arcs over the river, and Superman dives through the soot to catch them before they break apart over a crowded shoreline. Glass and steel rain into traffic, and a ferry's alarms scream as he moves through heat and metal, fingers ripping apart a warhead with the gentlest touch that still shreds armored plating. Soldiers shout from a rooftop, radios spitting orders that mean nothing to the civilians below, while a fleet of shadow helicopters converges, their rotors throwing up a wall of dust and fear. A city that thought itself prepared learns, in one inhalation of smoke and iron, that a single act can rewrite every plan in Washington. He catches the last projectile above a hospital and holds it like an accusation, while sirens and cameras turn toward him and the first voices begin to ask, not if he can save them, but who will own him. This is only the beginning. Worse is already waking. If you want to see how far power can be shaped or weaponized, subscribe now. Hit subscribe. This is a warning, not a suggestion. You will want to know what comes next, because whatever happens here changes how the world will be protected or broken. By the time Superman lands in the middle of the collapsed freeway interchange, the smoke has already turned the afternoon into a dull orange haze that stings the eyes of everyone trapped beneath the wreckage. A tanker truck has overturned and split open across 3 lanes, spilling fuel toward a line of commuter buses that were trying to reverse out when the first explosions echoed from the Port District. He doesn't stop to assess the source of the attack because he can already hear the heartbeats inside the buses rising into panic, and instead he lifts the tanker with a careful application of strength that bends the metal without snapping it, long enough to let firefighters drag hoses through the gap. Overhead, the sonic crack of incoming aircraft rolls across the skyline, and the moment those engines change pitch, he knows this isn't a rescue operation arriving to help him. A formation of matte black fighters cuts through the haze and circles back over the city in a pattern that is far too tight to be anything except a containment maneuver, while ground units begin sealing intersections with armored vehicles that were never staged here for disaster relief. The insignias on the hulls belong to branches that don't normally operate inside city limits, and the commands barking over encrypted frequencies begin to stack into a shape that feels less like emergency response and more like perimeter control. He hears the authorization codes being repeated with clipped urgency, hears the phrase, asset proximity, threaded between coordinates that map directly onto his position, and realizes that someone expected him to be here before the first missile was ever launched. The civilians don't notice the shift yet because they're still focused on getting out from under broken concrete, but the soldiers who arrive in tight formation keep glancing upward as though waiting for him to move. Within minutes, the outer ring locks down, and a convoy of unmarked transports pushes through a corridor that exists only because troops are willing to aim rifles at anyone who steps out of line. The vehicles halt 50 yards from where he's holding up a slab of fractured overpass that would otherwise collapse onto a trapped ambulance, and a man in a dark suit steps out between 2 officers whose posture marks them as high command. The badge he produces identifies him as a liaison from the Pentagon, though the way the troops defer suggests his authority extends well beyond public organizational charts. He doesn't shout over the noise or attempt to gesture Superman closer, and instead waits until the slab is set down and the paramedics are free before he speaks into a directional mic that carries his voice cleanly through the chaos. He thanks Superman for the assistance in a tone that feels rehearsed and immediately pivots to describing a joint stabilization framework that would allow federal agencies to coordinate with him during future incidents of national security concern. The language is clinical enough to pass for diplomacy, but the implication settles into the air like fallout because it reframes everything that just happened as a demonstration of capability rather than a humanitarian act. He talks about deterrence thresholds and response latency as though the city were a proving ground, and when Superman asks whether civilians were endangered to create an opportunity for this conversation, The liaison simply notes that the current threat vector originated offshore and remains active. Around them, cameras have begun to gather on rooftops, drawn by the sudden realization that this is no longer just a rescue scene, but a negotiation. Miles away in a glass tower that bears the stylized V of Vought, an emergency strategy session is already in progress as analysts replay the footage of Superman intercepting the first wave of missiles. The room hums with the low tension of executives who understand that public perception can pivot faster than any market index. And the moment the Pentagon liaison appears on screen beside him, the conversation turns from admiration to threat assessment. This wasn't how brand displacement was supposed to happen, because the government was never meant to seek alternatives to their flagship protector. And the legal team begins drafting statements that frame independent heroics as destabilizing. They don't mention him by name yet, but the subtext lands in phrases about accountability and command structures that will be familiar to anyone who's watched the last decade of superhero oversight debates. Inside a private suite upstairs, Homelander watches the same footage with a smile that never reaches his eyes as the liaison's body language shifts from gratitude to expectation. He listens to the phrasing about integrated operations and shared objectives, and hears what it would mean for a new figure to be recognized as a federal partner rather than a corporate asset. The first flicker of territorial insecurity manifests as a dismissive laugh that he directs toward no one in particular. But the silence that follows stretches long enough for it to curdle into something else. By the time the feed cuts to aerial shots of the lockdown perimeter, he has already begun to imagine the narrative as a contest for legitimacy. Back on the freeway, Superman declines to commit to anything beyond continued rescue work, noting that cooperation cannot come at the cost of independence when lives are on the line. The liaison nods as though this were an anticipated response and signals to an officer, who relays a command that shifts the aircraft pattern into a tighter orbit above the harbor. Radar operators have identified a second wave inbound, and the convoy's communications unit begins broadcasting evacuation routes that funnel civilians away from the waterfront. As sirens multiply and the sky fills with contrails, the offer remains suspended between them, unfinished and already shaping what comes next. The second wave doesn't arrive as a clean formation, and that alone tells Superman that whatever launched the first barrage was never intended to follow conventional targeting logic. The missiles break the cloud layer in scattered intervals that force him to choose between interception points, because the moment he commits to one trajectory, another veers toward a residential block that hasn't finished evacuating. He hears the Pentagon's evacuation broadcasts redirecting traffic into corridors that were never designed for this volume, and realizes that even a perfect defense overhead will fail if panic locks the streets below. So instead of chasing every inbound signature, he begins moving the buses that never made it out, lifting them clear of intersections, and setting them down along rail lines where trains have already been halted. Above the harbor, the fighter formation tightens again as the command net inside the Pentagon updates its threat map in real time, and the liaison from the freeway now speaks with the urgency of someone who has authorization to escalate. He calls out the timing of Superman's interceptions as though they were data points to be optimized, suggesting flight paths that would place him in the highest probability intercept window. The proposal sounds like coordination on the surface, but the subtext is unmistakable because it assumes that his movements can be scheduled like any other asset in the battle space. When Superman diverts from the suggested vector to catch a falling commuter rail car that lost power during the first blast, the liaison's tone shifts toward concern about mission drift. That phrase, mission drift, begins circulating across networks that were never meant to intersect with public rescue operations, and within minutes it appears in a chyron beneath live footage carried by Vought's preferred news partners. In a downtown studio owned by Vought, commentators begin asking whether independent heroics could interfere with coordinated defense strategies, while looping the moment he ignored the proposed intercept path. The framing is subtle enough to pass as analysis, but it plants the idea that humanitarian choices might undermine national security if they're made outside a command structure. By the time the segment cuts to interviews with retired generals, the question has evolved into whether cooperation should be a prerequisite for operating in contested airspace. Inside the same tower, Homelander steps onto a private balcony and watches the contrails twist above the river like scars that refuse to close. He hears the commentators' echo language about integration and accountability, and recognizes an opening that didn't exist yesterday, because it allows him to position himself as the protector who already understands command. The idea that the government might formalize a partnership with someone else gnaws at the edges of his composure, but he channels it into a plan that begins with visibility. Within the hour, Vought schedules a press availability that will place him in uniform beside a flag that has been adjusted for optimal camera balance. Meanwhile, in a warehouse that has been converted into a surveillance hub by the boys, Billy Butcher studies the same evacuation corridors with a skepticism that borders on paranoia. He's less interested in the missiles than in the way traffic is being funneled into zones that overlap with pre-existing military staging areas, because it suggests a rehearsal that began long before today. Huey flags the Pentagon liaison's phrasing as well, noting how quickly coordination became expectation, and the room falls quiet as they consider what it would mean if recruitment were the primary objective. For the first time, their distrust isn't aimed at the soup on screen, but at the institution trying to define him. On the waterfront, Superman finishes stabilizing a hospital wing whose foundation shifted under the shockwave, and returns to the sky just as the liaison updates him on a third inbound signature that's larger than anything seen so far. The recommended intercept window would place him over open water, minimizing debris if the payload detonates prematurely, but it also requires abandoning a cluster of ferries that have lost propulsion near the docks. He chooses the ferries first because their passengers have nowhere else to go, and uses heat vision with surgical precision to weld ruptured hull plates long enough for tugboats to secure tow lines. By the time he climbs back into the cloud layer, the larger signature has split into multiple fragments that begin falling toward the industrial district. The liaison's voice cuts through again, tighter now, warning that deviation from coordinated vectors increases the probability of infrastructure loss, and suggesting that a formal framework would prevent these trade-offs in the future. Superman doesn't argue because there's no time left for philosophy, and instead accelerates toward the falling fragments as cranes and storage tanks loom beneath them. The offer remains unaccepted, but the expectation has already been broadcast, and the city is learning that every choice he makes will now be measured against a standard he never agreed to meet. By the time the last fragment of the split payload is guided into the bay and allowed to detonate beneath the surface, the conversation has already shifted away from whether Superman saved the industrial district and toward whether he followed the recommended intercept sequence. The Pentagon's after-action summary circulates through defense committees within hours, and the phrasing is careful enough to avoid direct criticism while still highlighting deviations from coordinated response paths. What began as a rescue effort is now being processed as a case study in interoperability, with footnotes that quietly ask how outcomes might improve under a unified command framework. The liaison's earlier proposal reappears in policy drafts that describe partnership not as recruitment, but as resilience. Inside the Pentagon, analysts begin modeling response scenarios that treat Superman's presence as a variable, whose effectiveness depends on integration with existing doctrine. They map evacuation flows against his observed flight patterns, calculating how civilian survival rates might change if his intercepts were scheduled alongside fighter patrols and naval defenses. The exercise is presented as a humanitarian optimization, but the conclusions all converge on the same premise. Independence introduces uncertainty that command structures are designed to eliminate. A briefing prepared for senior leadership reframes his reluctance as an opportunity to formalize trust through oversight. Vought's communications division moves faster because narrative control operates on a different clock than policy. And within the same news cycle, Vought launches a campaign that positions cooperation as the true measure of heroism. Panels fill with retired officers who praise those willing to operate within established chains of command, and graphics compare coordinated deployments with independent interventions in ways that favor predictability over improvisation. The footage of Superman choosing the ferries over the recommended intercept window becomes a recurring example of how compassion can complicate strategy, even when the outcome appears positive. The implication lands gently but persistently. A protector who won't integrate may still be admirable, but he is not accountable. At a midday press availability staged beneath carefully balanced lighting, Homelander answers questions about readiness with the practiced ease of someone who understands both the camera and the chain of command. He speaks about alignment with national objectives and the importance of unified response in the face of asymmetric threats, never nomming Superman, but allowing the contrast to hang in the air. When asked whether independent actors could disrupt coordinated defense, he nods toward the flag behind him and notes that protection is strongest when it operates as part of a system. The applause that follows is less about substance than about reassurance, and it carries across feeds that were primed to receive it. Across town, the warehouse hub used by the boys hums with new data as Huey overlays evacuation maps with property ownership records that reveal something unsettling. The corridors used to funnel civilians away from the waterfront intersect with logistics zones leased by defense contractors months earlier, suggesting that today's routes were planned with more than disaster relief in mind. Butcher listens as Starlight points out how quickly the media pivoted from survival to compliance, and the room begins to consider whether recruitment might require a crisis dramatic enough to justify oversight. Their attention returns to the liaison's proposal, now echoed by commentators who frame it as a reasonable step toward stability. Superman spends the afternoon reinforcing a damaged power substation whose failure would cascade across 3 boroughs, and listens as emergency broadcasts begin incorporating language about coordinated hero response. The phrasing is new enough to stand out, because it treats his involvement as a component that can be scheduled rather than a presence that arrives when needed. When the liaison contacts him again to request a formal meeting in a secure facility, the invitation is framed as an opportunity to ensure that future rescues occur within a structure designed to maximize safety. He agrees to talk, but only after the substation is stabilized and the hospitals downstream confirm that their generators can stand down. By evening, markets have begun to react to the possibility of a federal partnership that could redefine deterrence, and defense stocks surge on speculation alone. The city's recovery is no longer the dominant headline because the story has become about legitimacy and who gets to define it, and the meeting time circulates through channels that were never meant to intersect with primetime coverage. As night settles over a skyline still lit by emergency strobes, the offer takes on the weight of inevitability, and the cameras are already in place. By the time Superman arrives at the secure federal facility on the outskirts of the city, the traffic patterns inside downtown have already begun shifting in ways that have nothing to do with recovery and everything to do with anticipation. Commuters reroute themselves away from government districts where protests are beginning to gather, not because of anything he has done, but because of what the meeting represents. The invitation extended by the Pentagon has leaked in enough detail to ignite a public argument that splits along unfamiliar lines, as community leaders who once demanded oversight now worry about what oversight would mean when applied to someone who never asked for authority. Inside the facility, conference rooms that normally host procurement briefings have been reconfigured for optics, because the goal is no longer just to talk, but to be seen talking. The liaison from the freeway waits alongside a panel of advisors whose portfolios span humanitarian response and strategic deterrence, and they begin by acknowledging that his priorities during the attack preserve civilian life at a scale that no doctrine could replicate. The compliment lands as preamble to a framework that would place him within a rapid coordination network, designed to eliminate redundancy between federal agencies and any enhanced responders operating in domestic airspace. They describe it as a partnership that would allow him to maintain autonomy in execution while aligning objectives with national security mandates, and the phrasing is careful enough to avoid the word command. When he asks who defines those mandates, the room's silence stretches just long enough to confirm that the answer would not be him. Outside, downtown crowds swell as organizers call for transparency, and the first clashes with police begin when counter-protesters arrive carrying signs that frame cooperation as patriotism. Vought's preferred outlets cut between aerial shots of the gathering and pundits debating whether independence is compatible with accountability, while Vought amplifies testimonials from mayors who praise integrated hero response in past disasters. The narrative is no longer about yesterday's missiles, because it has become a referendum on whether protection should operate inside systems that voters can influence. Each chant that echoes through the streets reinforces the idea that the decision being negotiated behind reinforced glass belongs to the public as much as to the man in the room. On a rooftop overlooking the demonstrations, Homelander addresses a hastily assembled press scrum and speaks about unity in the face of uncertainty, positioning himself as proof that alignment with national objectives need not diminish compassion. He avoids direct comparison, but his references to shared purpose draw a line that viewers are encouraged to follow, and the applause that greets his closing remarks is carried live into living rooms already primed by the day's coverage. The effect is immediate because it reframes the meeting as a test that someone else has already passed, and it places pressure on a decision that has yet to be made. Within minutes, trending tags begin pairing his name with phrases about readiness that were absent from the conversation yesterday. In the warehouse hub, the boys track the protests with a mixture of dread and curiosity, because the property overlays they uncovered now intersect with planned police cordons in ways that suggest crowd control will serve multiple purposes. Starlight points out how quickly the argument has shifted from saving lives to earning trust, and Butcher notes that trust is easiest to formalize when it can be audited. They watch as financial tickers respond to speculation about federal partnerships and realize that the city's economy is beginning to hinge on a conversation it cannot hear. For the first time since the missiles fell, the stakes feel less like survival and more like ownership. Inside the facility, Superman declines to enter any arrangement that would allow operational priorities to be set by committees whose incentives are shaped by geopolitics rather than immediate need. He explains that cooperation during emergencies is inevitable, but cooperation cannot become allegiance without changing the meaning of every rescue that follows. The advisors pivot to contingency planning that assumes goodwill on all sides, yet the subtext acknowledges that refusal will necessitate alternative measures to ensure predictability. When he leaves, the press line outside the perimeter captures only the absence of agreement, and the city hears it as a decision anyway. As night deepens, municipal leaders request federal assistance to manage demonstrations that are no longer unified in their demands, and armored vehicles begin positioning along avenues that were cleared for evacuation just yesterday. The meeting's outcome is already reshaping how force will be applied to maintain order, and the first curfew advisories are drafted before midnight. What began as recruitment has expanded into a question of governance, and the answer is already moving through the streets. The first sign that refusal has consequences doesn't come from a statement or a press conference, but from a change in airspace control that reroutes civilian flights around corridors now designated for federal response assets. Superman notices it while guiding a medevac helicopter through turbulence created by military patrols that weren't present during the initial attack, and the pilot's confusion mirrors what's happening across municipal agencies trying to interpret updated directives. The new protocols originate from the Pentagon and are framed as temporary measures to ensure interoperability with any enhanced responders operating independently. Yet they introduce a level of friction that turns routine rescues into negotiations over clearance. Every minute spent confirming a corridor is a minute someone waits under rubble, and the math begins to change. At the same time, a quiet authorization moves through defense channels to activate contingency planning that had been drafted under the assumption that partnership might not materialize. The program's name never appears in public documents, but its objectives are clear to those assigned to it because they involve mapping Superman's likely response patterns against scenarios that require rapid containment of emerging threats. Analysts simulate disasters that would force him to choose between simultaneous crises, testing how quickly he can be drawn away from one to address another. The exercise is justified as preparedness, though its outcome depends on creating conditions that resemble the very chaos it claims to mitigate. Markets respond first because speculation has already primed investors to treat cooperation as a stabilizing force, and the absence of an agreement triggers volatility in sectors tied to emergency infrastructure. Insurance firms revise risk models that now include the possibility of independent intervention operating outside coordinated frameworks, while municipal bonds dip on fears that future disasters will hinge on negotiation rather than doctrine. The city's recovery budget becomes a casualty of uncertainty, and mayors who praised integration begin requesting federal assurances that cannot be given without reopening the conversation he just declined. In a broadcast carried by outlets aligned with Vought, commentators revisit the freeway rescue and ask whether deviations from recommended vectors might have increased long-term risk even as they saved immediate lives. The framing is no longer subtle because it pairs images of stabilized ferries with graphics illustrating potential infrastructure loss under uncoordinated response, inviting viewers to weigh compassion against predictability. Homelander appears via satellite to emphasize that readiness includes alignment, and his reassurance lands with audiences who have watched curfew advisories multiply overnight. The narrative shifts again as independence becomes a liability that must be managed. Across the city, demonstrations splinter into factions that disagree on whether oversight protects or compromises, and police deploy crowd control measures along evacuation routes that were cleared only days before. The same corridors used to move families away from danger now channel protesters toward checkpoints that double as staging areas for federal units. In the warehouse hub, the boys monitor the deployments and notice that several coincide with logistics zones leased months earlier by contractors tied to contingency planning. Butcher listens as Huey maps the overlap and realizes that today's unrest provides cover for rehearsals that would be difficult to justify otherwise. Superman spends the afternoon reinforcing levees upriver after seismic readings suggest that the earlier detonations destabilized embankments far beyond the harbor. He hears emergency frequencies request his presence downtown to assist with a transit tunnel collapse that has trapped hundreds. Yet the updated airspace directives require confirmation before he can approach. By the time clearance arrives, water has already begun to seep through compromised joints, and he diverts to hold the tunnel's ceiling long enough for rescue teams to extract passengers. The delay becomes a talking point within hours, cited as evidence that independent action complicates coordinated response even when compliance is attempted. As evening approaches, the Pentagon liaison contacts him with a revised proposal that emphasizes information sharing rather than operational alignment, suggesting that transparency alone could reduce friction. He asks whether the same transparency will apply to contingency plans that model his behavior as a variable, and the silence that follows answers more than any briefing could. Overhead, patrols adjust their patterns again, and the city learns that contingency has moved from paper to practice. By the next morning, the question of whether Superman will cooperate with federal coordination is no longer confined to domestic debate, because satellite imagery of the harbor detonations has already circulated through Allied defense ministries. Naval task forces reposition under the assumption that any enhanced responder operating independently inside U.S. airspace could become a factor in treaty obligations, and foreign analysts begin drafting briefings that treat his refusal as a strategic variable. Within the Pentagon, the language of partnership gives way to posture, as planners consider how global deterrence might be affected by a protector who answers to conscience rather than command. What was framed as a local integration challenge becomes an international stability concern overnight. Air defense networks in multiple countries quietly adjust identification protocols to account for a flight signature that does not correspond to any state actor, and diplomatic channels light up with requests for clarification that cannot be satisfied without reopening negotiations. Markets react again as shipping insurers revise premiums on routes that pass within range of recent incidents, citing uncertainty about response coordination in future crises. The city's port authority watches contracts stall while exporters seek guarantees that no one can provide, and municipal leaders discover that yesterday's curfews have become footnotes in a broader economic recalibration. The story has shifted from governance to geopolitics without a single additional missile being launched. In a special broadcast carried by networks aligned with Vought, a panel of international security experts debates whether independent heroics could trigger escalation if misinterpreted by foreign early warning systems. Homelander appears in studio to emphasize that alignment with national objectives provides clarity that reduces the risk of accidental confrontation, and his remarks are clipped into segments that circulate across time zones. The implication is no longer about accountability at home, but about predictability abroad, inviting viewers to consider how autonomy might complicate alliance commitments. Within hours, trending discussions in Allied capitals mirror the language first used by Pentagon advisors. Across town, the warehouse hub used by the boys fills with new intercepts as Huey flags a memorandum requesting expanded rehearsals under the contingency program activated after the meeting. Starlight notes that several scenarios involve simultaneous disasters in separate jurisdictions, forcing prioritization decisions that could be framed as negligence if misaligned with federal guidance. Butcher listens as financial tickers reflect shipping delays tied to revised risk models, and realizes that economic pressure may achieve what recruitment could not. The group's distrust sharpens as they consider how global posture can be leveraged to redefine local choice. Superman spends the afternoon assisting with an offshore oil platform fire, whose smoke threatens to blanket coastal neighborhoods, and coordinates with civilian crews who now require clearance from updated maritime protocols before approaching. He uses heat vision with surgical precision to sever compromised supports without igniting additional fuel, aware that any misstep could be interpreted through the lens of international risk. When a foreign patrol aircraft alters course to observe from a distance, the gesture reads as curiosity to some and as caution to others watching live feeds. The burden of being seen expands beyond the city, and every rescue becomes a signal. As night falls, Allied embassies request briefings that hinge on whether the United States intends to formalize a relationship that would clarify his status under international law. The liaison reaches out again, this time emphasizing that information sharing could stabilize markets and reassure partners even in the absence of operational alignment. He asks whether reassurance will require concessions that change how he decides who to save first, and the line remains quiet long enough for the answer to travel anyway. In the silence, Fleets hold position and insurance rates climb, and the world adjusts to a protector who will not be scheduled. By the time the morning cycle of international briefings concludes, the domestic conversation has already been rewritten into something far more pointed, because the question is no longer whether Superman can be integrated into a command structure, but whether he should be allowed to operate without one. Editorials begin to frame independence as a gap in national readiness, and footage of delayed tunnel clearance circulates beside interviews with commuters who spent hours waiting for confirmation that never should have been necessary. The shift feels subtle until you realize that his rescues are now being discussed in terms of compliance rather than outcome, as if lives saved must also satisfy procedural expectations. In committee rooms across Washington, staffers begin drafting language that would authorize alternative partnerships to ensure continuity. Within the Pentagon, contingency planning expands to include public messaging that emphasizes resilience through redundancy, a phrase that quietly invites the possibility of a different protector operating within established doctrine. The proposal stops short of nomming anyone, but it outlines criteria that align almost perfectly with a figure already accustomed to coordination. When the memo leaks in partial form, commentators speculate about readiness programs that could deploy aligned assets during simultaneous crises, reducing reliance on independent intervention. The city's recovery becomes a backdrop to a narrative that treats substitution as prudence. That narrative finds a face when Homelander appears at a disaster preparedness summit flanked by municipal leaders eager for reassurance. He speaks about the importance of operating within shared objectives, noting that alignment allows responders to anticipate one another's movements rather than compete for airspace. The applause that follows carries a different tone than before because it now responds to an implied vacancy, and the summit's livestream trends alongside hashtags that pair his name with continuity. Vought's production team ensures that clips highlighting his familiarity with command protocols circulate before the afternoon markets close. Inside Vought, executives pivot from defense to offense as advertising slots are repurposed to showcase coordinated responses in past emergencies. Graphics compare integrated deployments with independent interventions using metrics that favor predictability, and testimonials from emergency managers emphasize the comfort of knowing who is in charge. The campaign avoids direct criticism while inviting viewers to imagine how today's delays might have been mitigated by alignment. By evening, the idea of a replacement has moved from speculation to solution, in the minds of audiences primed by a week of uncertainty. In the warehouse hub, the boys track the summit feed with growing concern as Huey overlays contractor leases with venues scheduled for future preparedness drills. Starlight notes that several exercises coincide with municipalities that requested federal assurances after the curfew advisories, suggesting that readiness will be demonstrated where anxiety runs highest. Butcher considers how easily a public appetite for predictability can be redirected towards someone who promises it, and the group begins to monitor travel manifests for signs of an imminent deployment. The replacement narrative is no longer theoretical because logistics are already moving. Superman spends the afternoon stabilizing a high-rise whose foundation shifted under aftershocks from the harbor detonation, and listens as emergency dispatchers begin routing certain requests through federal liaisons before contacting him directly. The new protocol introduces delays that mirror the tunnel incident, yet it also ensures that coordinated assets can be staged nearby. When he asks why calls are being triaged this way, a dispatcher admits that municipalities were advised to prioritize responders operating within established frameworks during peak congestion. The guidance doesn't forbid his involvement, but it reshapes the order in which help arrives. As dusk settles, a joint announcement schedules a large-scale preparedness drill in the very districts that saw the heaviest protests, featuring an aligned protector operating under municipal command. The invitation to observe is extended to all enhanced responders willing to participate within the framework, and cameras are already in place. What began as recruitment has become comparison, and the demonstration is set to begin whether he attends or not. By mid-morning, the districts selected for the preparedness drill have been transformed into a maze of barricades and observation platforms, and municipal officials move through rehearsed briefings that emphasize coordination above all else. Superman watches from a distance as emergency dispatchers redirect routine calls towards staging areas established under federal guidance, because the exercise requires real-time integration with responders who operate inside a defined chain of command. The framework has been cleared through the Pentagon and marketed as a test of continuity, yet its true purpose becomes apparent as cameras linger on the command consoles that track every movement. What is being demonstrated is not speed or strength, but predictability. When Homelander arrives under municipal escort, the applause carries across blocks that were still hosting protests 2 nights earlier, and the shift in tone reflects a public appetite for reassurance that can be measured as easily as any response time. He takes his place beside emergency managers who speak about shared objectives, and the drill begins with simulated infrastructure failures that require coordinated aerial support. Each maneuver is narrated through live feeds that highlight alignment with dispatch protocols, and graphics compare anticipated outcomes under independent intervention with those achieved inside the framework. The implication is reinforced with every successful extraction. Integration reduces uncertainty. Inside Vought, production teams cut the livestream into segments that emphasize how quickly requests move from dispatch to deployment when responders accept municipal command. Commentators praise the clarity provided by a unified chain of communication, noting that simultaneous crises can be triaged without negotiation. The footage of Homelander lifting debris under direction from on-site coordinators is paired with testimonials from emergency planners, who describe the comfort of knowing that priorities will be followed. By the time the afternoon cycle begins, the drill has become a case study in governance rather than a rehearsal for disaster. Across town, the warehouse hub used by the boys fills with feeds that reveal how certain real emergencies are being folded into the exercise to enhance authenticity. Huey flags a transit derailment that has been rerouted into the drill's jurisdiction, allowing aligned responders to arrive first under municipal command. Starlight notes that dispatch logs now include categories for independent assets whose involvement must be cleared before entry, and Butcher realizes that the demonstration is quietly rewriting response norms. What appears to be readiness is also a rehearsal for exclusion. Superman answers a call from a clinic whose oxygen systems failed during a power fluctuation, and arrives to find that backup generators have been delayed by traffic diverted toward the drill. He stabilizes the supply with careful heat vision adjustments that avoid igniting nearby materials, while listening to dispatchers request clearance for additional assistance that has already been staged nearby. The delay becomes another data point for commentators who argue that integration prevents bottlenecks, even as the clinic's patients begin to breathe easier. His presence remains effective, but its timing is now framed as secondary. As evening approaches, municipal leaders announce preliminary results that favor coordinated deployment in scenarios involving simultaneous crises, and invite federal partners to expand the framework to additional districts. The invitation extends again to any enhanced responder willing to participate under established protocols, and the cameras pan to the observation platforms where analysts take notes. The demonstration ends, but the comparison it created is already moving into policy drafts that will outlast the applause. By the time the drill's preliminary results are circulated through municipal councils, the framework has already begun reshaping how assistance is requested, because dispatch systems now include a tiered approval process that places aligned responders at the front of the queue. Superman hears it in the hesitation that precedes certain calls, as operators confirm whether federal coordination has been activated before relaying location that would once have been broadcast immediately. The adjustment is justified as an efficiency measure endorsed by the Pentagon, yet it introduces a delay that transforms seconds into variables subject to review. What was framed as preparedness begins to function as gatekeeping. In districts that hosted the demonstration, emergency managers adopt guidance that routes simultaneous incidents through command centers capable of integrating aligned assets without negotiation. Requests that cannot be scheduled within the framework are flagged for secondary response, a category that does not forbid his involvement, but ensures that he will arrive after priorities have been set elsewhere. The policy is presented as a safeguard against congestion, though its practical effect is to deny him the immediacy that defined his earlier rescues. Infrastructure failures that once drew him first now become case studies in compliance. Vought amplifies the shift with a media campaign that highlights how strategic denial prevents overlap during peak demand, pairing footage of coordinated deployments with graphics that illustrate reduced response times. Homelander appears alongside emergency planners who praise the clarity provided by municipal command, and the segment frames alignment as the difference between anticipation and improvisation. Viewers are invited to consider how predictability reduces risk across interconnected systems, and the narrative lands with audiences still processing last week's curfews. Independence is recast as a luxury that stability cannot afford. Inside the warehouse hub, the boys track dispatch logs that reveal a growing pattern of secondary classifications in neighborhoods where protests were most intense. Huey overlays the data with contractor leases tied to contingency planning, and Starlight notes that several flagged incidents occur within zones scheduled for expanded framework adoption. Butcher listens as financial indices stabilize in response to the new protocols, and realizes that economic reassurance may hinge on limiting unscheduled intervention. The policy is working as intended because it changes behavior without issuing a ban. Superman spends the afternoon reinforcing a water treatment plant whose intake valve seized during a power surge, and coordinates with crews who must now confirm alignment before approaching restricted corridors. He uses heat vision with measured precision to free the mechanisms without compromising filtration systems, aware that any misstep will be evaluated against the framework's benchmarks. When a dispatcher apologizes for the delay in relaying the call, citing tiered approval requirements, he notes that timing determines outcomes long before reports are written. The apology travels through frequencies that are already recording compliance metrics. As night falls, a regional blackout tests the new system by triggering simultaneous outages across 3 boroughs, and command centers prioritize aligned deployments to stabilize grid nodes deemed critical to economic continuity. Requests from residential blocks are flagged for secondary response, and by the time clearance reaches him, elevators have stalled and medical equipment has begun to fail. He moves anyway, but the order in which he can help has been decided elsewhere. Strategic denial becomes lived experience, and the city learns that governance can arrive disguised as guidance. The blackout doesn't resolve cleanly, and that alone begins to expose the limits of a system that was designed to prioritize continuity over immediacy. Because while grid nodes tied to financial districts stabilize under coordinated deployment, entire residential corridors remain in darkness long enough for panic to compound existing damage. Superman moves between stalled subway cars and high-rise stairwells, where patients dependent on powered respirators are being carried floor by floor, and hears dispatchers struggle to reconcile secondary classifications with escalating need. The tiered approvals endorsed by the Pentagon begin to stack into queues that cannot account for human physiology, and the math of survival starts to diverge from the metrics used to justify the framework. In a command center downtown, Emergency managers route the most visible crises through aligned channels to maintain public confidence, while quieter incidents are logged for later response that may arrive too late to matter. Homelander is deployed under municipal direction to reinforce substation whose stabilization can be broadcast in real time, and the footage carries across networks as proof that integration delivers results. Vought packages the response into a live segment that emphasizes restored service in business districts, inviting viewers to equate illumination with safety. The neighborhood still waiting do not trend. Across town, the warehouse hub used by the boys flags a transit tunnel where water intrusion has begun to compromise electrical systems that were never meant to operate without continuous power. Huey notes that the incident falls within a zone classified for secondary response, and Starlight watches as dispatch requests are rerouted through approval channels that remain occupied by higher priority nodes. Butcher understands that delay will transform a maintenance issue into a disaster, and the group tracks how quickly policy can convert infrastructure into risk. The tunnel's status shifts from inconvenience to emergency before clearance arrives. Superman reaches the site in time to brace a failing support while crews evacuate commuters through access hatches, and uses heat vision with surgical restraint to seal a ruptured conduit that threatens to electrify standing water. The intervention prevents immediate catastrophe, yet the arrival time is recorded against benchmarks that will later be cited in oversight reviews. When he requests additional pumps from nearby staging areas, operators explain that aligned deployments remain committed to grid stabilization under municipal command. The logic holds on paper even as the tunnel's lower levels continue to flood. As dawn approaches, a hospital within the same borough reports generator failure tied to voltage fluctuations that propagated through secondary circuits, and the call enters a queue already burdened by competing approvals. By the time he arrives, staff have begun manual ventilation for patients who cannot be moved, and the margin for error has narrowed beyond what doctrine can measure. He stabilizes the system long enough for backup units to be installed, but the delay becomes a statistic that circulates through policy briefings before the sun rises. The incident moves from rescue to report with unsettling speed. By midday, commentators cite the blackout as evidence that unscheduled intervention complicates coordinated recovery, even as residents describe wading through approvals that never came. Municipal leaders request an inquiry into response sequencing, and the liaison reaches out with a proposal to formalize information sharing that would reduce future friction. He asks whether friction includes the time it takes for permission to travel through a chain of command, and the silence that follows carries into the hearing scheduled for the afternoon. The incident is already being measured. By the time Superman arrives at the municipal chamber convened to review the blackout response, the incident has already been distilled into charts that compare projected outcomes under coordinated deployment with those recorded during secondary intervention. The committee's briefing references guidance endorsed by the Pentagon and emphasizes how tiered approvals preserved continuity in districts tied to economic stability, even as residential corridors experienced prolonged outages. What is presented as balance reads to those in attendance as triage conducted by policy rather than proximity, and the hearing's agenda reflects a city trying to reconcile metrics with memory. Lives stabilized in stairwells now sit beside restored grid nodes in a ledger that cannot agree on priority. Witnesses from emergency management testify that aligned deployments allowed command centers to anticipate resource needs across simultaneous crises, reducing overlap that might have stranded critical infrastructure. Homelander appears via SecureLink to describe how operating within municipal direction enabled rapid reinforcement of substations whose failure would have cascaded into regional collapse, and his remarks are entered into the record alongside response timelines. Vought submits a statement highlighting how integrated action restored service to business districts before market close, stabilizing indices that fund recovery bonds. The argument is no longer about heroism because it has become about governance. Across the aisle, residents from the borough that hosted the transit tunnel incident recount, wading through approval cycles that transformed maintenance failures into medical emergencies, and their testimony resists quantification. A nurse describes manual ventilation performed by flashlight, while dispatchers sought clearance for assistance staged 2 blocks away, and the room absorbs a silence that no graphic can annotate. When asked whether earlier arrival would have changed outcomes, she nods toward the committee's charts and asks who decides which delays are acceptable. The question lingers long enough to shift the hearing's tone from audit to accountability. In the warehouse hub, the boys track the proceedings as Huey overlays the committee's projections with property maps tied to contingency rehearsals conducted during the protests. Starlight notes that several zones prioritized for grid stabilization correspond to logistics corridors leased months before the harbor detonations, and Butcher considers how preparedness can shape what counts as essential. The group's suspicion hardens into something closer to certainty as economic testimony eclipses accounts from stairwells. The framework's logic begins to look less like efficiency and more like selection. When Superman is invited to respond, he explains that cooperation during emergencies is inevitable but cannot replace judgment formed at the point of need, because seconds lost to permission can decide outcomes long before reports are filed. He declines to endorse a system that schedules assistance according to economic continuity, noting that protection loses meaning when proximity yields to priority lists drafted in advance. Committee members ask whether information sharing might reduce friction without imposing command, and he asks whether friction includes the time it takes for responsibility to be negotiated. The exchange enters the record as fleets hold position offshore and insurers revise premiums again. As the session adjourns, municipal leaders announce interim measures that expand the framework pending further review, citing market stability and alliance reassurance as factors that cannot be ignored. Dispatch protocols update within the hour, and calls from secondary zones begin entering longer queues by design. The hearing closes, but the policy it advanced is already moving through the city. By the time the interim measures take effect across municipal dispatch systems, the framework has already altered how emergencies are perceived, because calls from designated secondary zones now enter queues calibrated to preserve continuity in districts tied to economic recovery. Superman hears it in the extended hold tones that precede certain relays, and understands that protection has been translated into scheduling by policies endorsed through the Pentagon. What was presented as cooperation without command now functions as prioritization without proximity, and the shift is reflected in how assistance is staged before he ever receives coordinates. The city's new deterrence is measured in approvals. Aligned deployments expand under municipal direction, as Homelander appears alongside emergency managers to inaugurate additional command centers capable of integrating response across simultaneous incidents. Vought packages the rollout into a campaign that equates predictability with safety, and the footage of coordinated arrivals becomes a nightly reassurance for markets still recovering from volatility. Business districts stabilize under a cadence that can be anticipated by insurers and investors, while residential corridors learn to wait within systems designed to minimize overlap. The replacement narrative settles into routine. Across town, the warehouse hub used by the boys tracks dispatch logs that confirm a growing disparity between scheduled assistance and unsanctioned intervention. Huey notes that secondary classifications now persist through peak congestion, and Starlight watches as municipal guidance advises residents to remain in place until aligned responders can be assigned. Butcher considers how governance can be enacted through delay, and the group's attention turns to what permanence looks like when policy outlasts crisis. The framework no longer needs a hearing because it has become practice. Superman spends the afternoon stabilizing a school gym converted into a cooling center after grid fluctuations return during a heat wave, and listens as coordinators request clearance for additional support that has already been staged nearby. He moves through the building with careful restraint, adjusting ventilation systems with heat vision that avoids compromising structural integrity, aware that any intervention will be evaluated against benchmarks drafted in committee. When a dispatcher apologizes for the queue, citing updated prioritization, he notes that protection cannot be audited in hindsight. The apology enters a log that will be reviewed later. As evening approaches, Allied embassies issue statements welcoming the expanded framework as a stabilizing influence that clarifies response under treaty obligations, and shipping insurers revise premiums downward in anticipation of predictable deployments. Municipal leaders announce that the new deterrence model will remain in place pending legislative codification, citing alliance reassurance and market recovery as outcomes that cannot be reversed without consequence. The offer that was never meant to be refused has evolved into a system that no longer requires acceptance, and the world adjusts to a protector who will not be scheduled by building around him instead. The skyline holds, but the order beneath it has changed in ways that cannot be undone, and every future rescue will arrive within priorities he did not set.